Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I am a high school English teacher and a novelist, and I am wrapping up the semester, and I'm excited to be able to talk to Bob Seay about his book, The Bookseller's Son, because it is such a timely topic. It's kind of come up for me recently in my job, and I'm glad this book kind of came to me. I stumbled across it through a friend, and I'm really excited to talk about The Bookseller's Son. But before I go off on too many tangents, Bob, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Bob Seay, and thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. I live in Colorado. I recently retired from teaching. I retired in 2024, and The Bookseller's Son is my fifth novel.
So before we dive into some questions and specific topics that I want to talk with you about, give our listeners a little bit of an overview of what The Bookseller's Son is about.
The Bookseller's Son is about book banning and censorship and who gets to control the stories that we tell. Because really, when you think about it, that's what book banning and censorship come down to. It's a decision by some people or by a group of people to decide what are we going to allow other people to know. It's a control of information. That's the only way you can call it. And The Bookseller's Son addresses that issue. I also tried to give a historical perspective, which was one of the more challenging things in the book. It's set in the 70s, so I only used books that were within that time frame. And I was working between some very real world dates, the McCarthy hearings, the Vietnam War, things like that. So it was the most researched book I think I've ever written in my life.
Yeah, and we'll get into more of that because I had some specific questions about the time period and the setting. But I wanted to just dive in a little bit first. Your main character, Jeremiah, is, as the book title says, grew up in this bookstore. His parents own the store. And the bulk of the story is when he takes over, and he's really kind of got to start figuring out, like, this is kind of landed in his lap a little bit. And he has to really stop and think, like, okay, is this something I'm interested in? Do I actually care about any of the things that his parents cared about? If so, how much? What's he willing to put his energy and effort into? And that on its own, I think, is something that, whether readers love books and freedom of speech and everything else that the book covers, I think just on that first level, this is so relatable to so many people, of just finding yourself in a position where you have to stop and be like, wait, what do I want to do with my life? And
Yeah, when you're
I love
writing,
that.
I'm sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
When you're writing stuff, you have to conceptualize it, And when I would describe the book to myself or when I was telling other people about it, I kept calling it The Lion King in a Bookstore, because it's all about that issue of legacy and what do we owe to our parents? What do we owe to ourselves? What happens when you inherit a legacy that you're not quite sure you necessarily want? Where does all that lie? So that's what that was about. He's their son and they're famous, and he has to deal with what that represents for him in his life.
Well, and something that struck me about this is that I think a wide range of age groups can read this, understand it, and enjoy it. I teach ninth grade, and this was something that always as I'm reading, I'm like, is this something I can put, in my classroom when I'm done reading it? Will my kids relate to this? And aside from the fact that we're reading Animal Farm this year, and this ties into that well, also a lot of my students are at that age where they're starting to have to question what their parents want for them versus what they want in their life. And
Right.
sometimes that's like the overachieving, like you should have all A's. And sometimes it's like, well, we didn't do any of these things like college or professions, and you're not going to be able to do that either. So you might as well just settle. And I see these really extreme sides of that with kids. And that kept popping up in my mind as I was reading, of just, this is a really hard thing at a variety of ages. I think you kind of hit these points at multiple times in your life where you have to
Yeah.
reassess and be like, wait a minute, just because they want this or I should do this, what does that really mean for me? And it was just one of the many layers of this book that got me thinking. And I always enjoy a book that makes me pause for a minute and think about things and consider something that maybe I've held as true or thought a particular way about. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe I need to think on this a little bit harder.
Yeah, and in Jeremiah's case, at the beginning of the book, he's not even sure how he feels about book bans. I mean, he's working out his own personal feelings. He knows what he's supposed to feel because he knows what his parents believed. And he grew up hearing their speeches, and he grew up working in the environment, but he's not personally sure, are these my values or not? So not only is he dealing with their legacy and how do I perpetuate that, he's dealing with sorting out his own feelings and his own positions on that, which is a reflection of what I was going through as I wrote it, frankly. I wrote that book, I started that book thinking I felt one way about book bans. The more I got into it, the more I realized I'm not sure exactly how I feel about this. And so part of that process of Jeremiah deciding where he lands on that issue is me figuring out, where do I land on this issue? There's a lot of self in that book.
Well, and I think that's unavoidable for one when you're creating. I think you always put a little bit of yourself into whatever it is you're creating. But I think just where we are at right now in time, this is something that I think most people who are not just completely closed-minded and unwilling to reassess their thoughts have had to think about book banning and freedom of speech and censorship and propaganda and all these things that have really been prominent in our American culture and elsewhere. But it's something that you do have to stop and think about right now. Because it's like, I had this discussion with my kids recently in class where we were talking about rhetorical appeals and how you use them and like, where do the ethics lie in that? And that kind of transitioned into, well, who gets to decide some of these things when you're putting out, a social media ad? How truthful does it need to be? Is it okay to twist things a little bit? And that led into talking about who's in charge of what information gets out to people. And like I said, we're reading Animal Farm where there was some very strict censorship and relating that to the Russian history, which we've also been studying, that it got them to start thinking about where their information comes from and who gets to make that decision. And this book also brought up some really layered ideas that it's not a simple book of like, book bans are bad, everyone should stand against it, like this really one-sided approach, because you do bring up both sides and you have characters who are very relatable on either side of the argument and in the in-between spaces as well, which is not easy to do when it's a very hot-button, challenging issue that people can quickly go from like 0 to screaming in your face about this type of thing. So how did you balance showing the different perspectives related to book banning and censorship as you were writing this?
Well, almost everything in the book are ideas that I have heard at one time or another from people who were speaking on either side of that issue. I wanted to be fair. I didn't want to say, book ban bad, and go on like that. I didn't want to have some kind of Cruella de Vil villain in the book, although, Millicent comes off kind of like a villain. Obviously, Millicent is the villain of the book. But I wanted to be fair to those points of view, even the ones that I disagree with. Because if you're not fair, then you yourself are censoring. You have to present the ideas that they show honestly and let them speak for themselves. And then let people decide, okay, this is what I believe in, or this is crazy. So the biggest thing that I kept going on is this a fair presentation of these ideas? That was kind of like my guiding light through that whole thing. Am I presenting this in a realistic way? Would these people talk like this? Would they be concerned about these issues, and would they behave this way? And I didn't want to draw caricatures. I wanted real people in the story. Most of those characters, there's a couple in there that don't do this, but most of those characters are based on people I have known, which is a very easy thing. As a writer, I use models. I think, what would Joe say if he was in this situation? And that helps me a lot.
I think that's very good perspective on it, of looking at realistically what would be the response in this situation.
Yeah.
Because again, it can be really easy to mold it to enhance what you already believe rather than keeping that fair and balanced approach to it. Because I think that really inspires more critical thinking when you give a balanced viewpoint of something and people have to say like, well, okay, yeah, I can see that, but I can also see that. Where do I lie on that spectrum? Yeah. And whereas, if you're just getting one message shouted at you, it's much easier to tune that out and then just find other things that reinforce what you already think. And that's kind of the majority of social media right now, it feels like, is just shouting one side or the other and then not actually getting any real information about anything. which is very
Yeah, it's
frustrating.
just a shouting match, and it's so divided that it's ridiculous at this point. But again, I go back to what I said before. A lot of those discussions and a lot of Jeremiah's conflict in the book is a reflection of the conflict I was going through as I wrote it. The more I read about the history of this, the more I found out about what was going on even today, the more I had to work through all that. Now, a better writer might have gone back and fixed all that, in an editing process, but I went through and I just left it. This is me working out my feelings about this issue, which honestly really surprised me because I thought I had this thing locked in. I'm going to write a book that, book bans are bad because I've had to deal with that. I had a book that was removed from our local high school library, so I obviously had strong feelings about it. But as I got into it, and I'm thinking, I have an 8-year-old grandson. Do I want my 8-year-old grandson to have access to some of these books? And so it was me working out some of my own issues as I write it.
Well, and you bring up a lot of different things that maybe people don't think about when they're first considering something like book banning and censorship, of maybe appropriate ages or how information is accessed. Is it just freely available and open for anyone? Should there be some moderation? Even things where I thought it was interesting, you brought up at one point where your character Jeremiah is looking at children's books and he realizes, like, there really isn't anything available showing single
Yes.
parenthood in the
Well, single
70s.
fatherhood,
Yeah,
specifically
especially.
single fatherhood. Yeah, that was a real thing. I mean, because part of the book is we want books that people can see themselves in. You want a kid to read to see themselves in that book. They want recognition. They want to feel seen. They want to feel like somebody else is in my situation. And there are single parent books, but they're almost always single moms. Unless you're in a Disney movie who we kill off mom in the first act. But in most cases, single dads are rare in literature.
Yeah, even still today. And that was something in that section of the book. It got me thinking again about my students and like how many of my students and the issues and cultures and the different things that they face and deal with on a daily basis are not
Mm-hmm.
represented in most regular media sources that they can access easily. And I was kind of like making this mental list and it was getting pretty long. I was like, oh, geez. Yeah, like a lot of my students, I live in a pretty diverse area, the wide variety of students, both cultures, religions, where their families have come from over time, all of this. And it's like, when I'm looking through our book room at the school, it's like, yeah, none of these really hit all of those marks. Like they might get one or two. And not that I don't love classic literature. There's so many things to learn from classic literature, but it's like as we're moving forward, there's still such a huge gap in representation. And sometimes that's active censorship and banning. And sometimes it's a little quieter of, yeah, we don't really think that book will sell. So we're not going to buy it because we don't think there's enough people interested in your specific life experience. It's not mainstream enough to matter,
Yeah,
is the
you
message
hit
that
on
gets sent.
right. There's two things I want to hit on that. First of all, you hit on a very interesting point that there's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on in publishing and in the supply chain that gets books from the writer to the reader. And every node along that chain, the publishers, the distributors, the marketers, the local owners of bookstores, whatever, makes a decision whether to censor or not. And if they decide that they don't want to have a book in their store or in their public or in their library, then it's not going to happen. Also, all this anti-DEI, anti-woke stuff is, the great whitewashing of America. It's like they want to erase all evidence of diversity and all evidence of individuality. And, we want everybody to think this and everybody looks like this. And this is the only history that matters. So I think that the issue you just talked about is going to become even more difficult unless we can turn this around. I'm not sure how political you want to get on this conversation, but that's what's happening. I mean, in some point, when historians write about this period, they're going to refer to it as the Great Deletion or something like that, because that's exactly what's happening. You're not banning books; you're deleting people. And that was when I realized that. That was when I really was able to get a grip on. Okay, this is the issue that matters here. It's, books are important, but it's the people that they represent that are even more important. And that's what we should be fighting for. We're fighting for books, as we should, but the books represent people. that's how I felt when I was writing. But that was the lesson I learned as I was writing this.
I think that's very well said. So you think about everything that has been removed from
Oh God.
websites lately that has just disappeared. And yeah, like,
Right, they erase the Tuskegee Airmen, for God's sake.
mhm.
I mean, how ridiculous is that? And all this other stuff, because people are just too ignorant to even understand these concepts, or they fear it. That's the only reason you do this stuff, is because you're afraid of it. So we need to address that, and we need to do it quick while we still can, before it's permanently erased, like, the East Wing of the White House.
Yeah. Well, and it's been so interesting teaching Animal Farm this semester. And there's been so many times where my students will make comments like, how can these animals be so stupid? How can they let all of this happen? Why aren't they doing something about it? And I'm just like, this is
Yeah,
based on real life, guys. Like, this is happening today, and we still don't see it, and we still don't realize it. And we, just sit back and let people with power overrun everything else. And
absolutely.
it's I'm hoping that, this exposes them to, like, oh, maybe start opening our eyes a little bit more. Like, you guys are the next group who are going to come up and start being in charge of stuff. So remember some of these lessons, hopefully. We'll see. But it is so fascinating to see how history can repeat itself. And that was something I started off mentioning this, and I'm finally coming back around to it. But I did want to ask you about your choice to set it in the 70s to deal with these issues of book banning and censorship and who gets to be seen and heard, versus setting it in today's world where these issues are still extremely at the forefront. What was your thought process on that, of choosing your time period and how you were going to best be able to tell the story?
I wanted to avoid the, very special episode ripped from today's headlines kind of thing that you get, on TV all the time. I didn't want it to be a current event story. I wanted to show that this is a timeless issue. I didn't want to get bogged down in what's going on today, because there's, like you said, this is going on probably worse today than at any time since the 1950s. And I didn't want to get all wrapped up in that. And I felt like if I put it in the 70s, that it makes it a little bit more objective for the readers. It gives them a little bit of space between what they're seeing and what's happening, in the world, what they're reading in the book and what's happening in the world. And it just allowed the whole story to be more of about the issue of censorship as opposed to the politics of today. Honestly, that was part of it. The other thing, too, is in one of my other books, The Band Room, and I'm not trying to plug my books here, but I wrote The Band Room, and it is set in 2020, and it is a very 2020 book. So I realized after I did that nothing is more dated than a book that, talks about current events. That expires faster than a carton of milk. So why not just start off and just say, okay, we're just going to kick it back 50 years in the first place. If it's going to be dated anyway, then why don't we just kick it back 50 years and go from there?
Well, and I think it's interesting that when we look at something that's happened in history, it's a little bit easier to digest. Like, even when it's a topic that people have strong feelings about and they can get riled up about, if we're talking about something that happened 40, 50 years ago, I think it's a little bit easier to discuss that than to
Exactly.
immediately go to, well, I'm right about this and you're wrong about this, because it's already happened. It's in the past. You can't do anything about history.
Exactly. And that's what I was trying to do, was establish that distance between the reader and the subject matter. It gives them objectivity. It takes out this thing about, well, I just saw this just the other day. It allows you to present the ideas that you want to present without getting bogged down in what's right in front of people that they're tripping over.
Well, and hopefully it nudges people to make connections with current events in their own mind.
Oh, yeah.
Where you're leading them to that without, like, throwing it in their face.
I don't see how they can miss that. I mean, it's all,
You would hope.
I did everything I could to put it in bold type, It's like, hey, guys, I'm not really talking about 1972, okay? Do you understand that? But you have to be a frame. And it also became an intellectual exercise as I went on, because I could not put in some of the books that I really wanted to include because they weren't written within the time frame of the book. And so it became kind of a mystery piece for me almost. Okay, I need to find this book that says this on this date. And so that was just part of the intellectual exercise of writing it.
Well, and one of the books that you brought up was Where the Wild Things Are.
Yes.
And that was one of my favorite books growing up. I don't know how many times we read that as kids, like me and my siblings, and my mom would read it to us, and that book was probably falling apart. But like we loved that book. It was so cute. It had such a good message, and I had to like stop and think when I was reading yours, and I was like, "Wait, seriously? Why would someone have a problem with this book?" Like,
I
it
know.
was just
I
so mind-boggling to me.
When I was researching that, I would type in things like children's books that were banned between this date and that date. And that book came up, and I thought, you got to be kidding me. And so I started looking at it deeper to see, well, okay, why was it banned? Because it encourages disobedience and disorderly behavior. And some of those book bans, in fact, most of them in that book are local book bans. I should point that out. It's not like the state came down and said, we will not have this in, the state of Florida, to pick a random state for no particular reason. But Where the Wild Things Are was one of those cases where it would pop up in isolated districts. You would see bans for this book at this specific school. But I still did. I did take a little bit of liberty, though. Where the Wild Things Are, actually, I believe, if I'm remembering this right, came out in 74, and I think I have it coming out in 72 in the book because I needed him to have it in first grade. And I thought, okay, I'm going to give myself that much creative license here. Okay. But I couldn't believe it. And that was not the only one. I remember The Rabbit's Wedding. I had that book when I was a kid. It never occurred to me that that would be a banned book either. And Jeremiah took that book to school, and his teacher said, no, this is not acceptable.
Yeah, it's fascinating the things that people are scared of. And really, I think that's what most book bans boil down to, is someone has a fear reaction to something in a story, often because it challenges their own belief system, not because
Right.
they genuinely think that Harry Potter is going to turn kids into Satan worshipping witches. And
Although
I
there
don't.
are people out there who really take that very literally and actually do believe that. But you're right, the majority of rational humans do not think that way.
But yes, there are definitely those like more hardcore belief systems that do find that frightening. But it's like I feel like at least most of the time when something is banned, it's making someone confront something in their own belief system that they don't want to confront. And they're afraid that, especially children, if it's something that children have access to, like if it's making them uncomfortable, it might really challenge a younger mind that's a little bit more open, a little bit more flexible. And for an adult who has a very strict or strong belief system, that's scary to think, oh, my kid might turn away from what I believe in because they read this book. And rather than having an open and honest conversation with that child about whatever those messages are, unfortunately, that response sometimes is get rid of it. Don't even let
Yeah.
them look at it. Don't bring up the conversation. That's too hard. That's too scary or challenging. And that's just like, you're missing this wonderful opportunity to have a great conversation with your child about why you believe what you believe and what those challenges might be, and just learning more and
Right. And sometimes that
shutting that
fear,
down.
sometimes, I didn't mean to step on you there, I'm sorry. Sometimes that fear comes down to a fear of having their own authority questioned. It's not just a fear of, okay, if we all did this, then I'm afraid of what the outcome would be if the world was this way. Sometimes it's just the fact that they're afraid that their child's view might be different than their own. Millicent runs into that. It's like, I want to ban this book because I don't want people questioning my authority.
Loss of authority for someone who, like, that is a very valuable thing to them, that can inspire some quick and strong response. And
Absolutely.
we see that so many times in history. And again, we don't always learn from history, but
You know,
hopefully some of us will.
Authoritarians don't tend to be the best and the brightest. I
Not
mean, when you
often.
look at the history of that, there's not, I can't think of an authoritarian figure in history who ultimately was considered to be an intellectual. The two things just don't go. They're like an antithesis. They just don't fit.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, just that value and quest for power, like you've really got to shut down a lot of that part of your critical thinking side, because if you didn't, I don't think you'd be able to do the things that people in those positions and who carry out those sorts of things do. Like I just,
Correct. And the
yeah, I
people
don't
who
think you could do
follow
it.
them wouldn't be able to follow them either. I
Exactly.
mean, think about
Yeah.
the cognitive dissonance that these people have to overcome in order to hold some of
Hmm.
those positions. And then you have a book that's challenging that. Well, that's just one more thing that they don't want to have to deal with. So they ban it.
Absolutely. Well, your book gives lots and lots to think about on different levels. It's not just one thing or the other. I found myself pausing and thinking about so many different aspects that all kind of come into this and then that branch off from that as well. It was a fun read. You had really good characters, and I just loved how thought provoking it was all the way around. And we are already getting short on time because I just looked at the clock and I was like, holy cow, we're already at the end. But I did want to ask before we start to wrap up, are you working on anything now that we can keep an eye out for?
I just finished I Know Why Old Men Plant Trees, which is another book about legacy and the things that we leave behind. I guess I'm kind of stuck on legacy for some reason. And I'm working on a book now that I'm 8 chapters into and really is still very much in development. And I'm calling Schrodinger's Faith. It's like it exists in two states at the same time. And if you open the box, it dies, that kind of a thing. So that's probably the deepest book I've ever written. Is what I'm working on right now.
Oh, sounds really interesting. Okay, we'll have to stay in touch. Well, where can people find you online and find the book if they would like to check out this great story and just stay up to date on your future projects?
Amazon. You can go to Amazon and just Google either the title of the book, The Bookseller's Son, or my name, Bob Seay. It's spelled Seay. Or they can go to my website, bobseay.com, and I have them for sale there. You can get them through Amazon, you can get them through Barnes and Nobles, or you can buy them through Ingram Spark.
Wonderful. So it's always nice when things are widely available and easy to find for people.
Yeah.
And one last thing, as we start to wrap up, being that you have been in education, this is something as far as people looking to get new books and having authors come in. Do you do any sort of author visits that maybe just in your area, probably not like, going to London or anything for talk to
I wish.
some UK sixth graders. But if someone was interested in having you come and chat with their class about what you do or book bans or any of your topics, how would they do that?
They can just go through the website. The email addresses are on the website. They can contact me, and I would be glad to do that. I love talking about my books, even if it was something like a Zoom call, in front of a classroom or in front of a local book club. I've done a couple of book clubs where, there was a book club in St. Louis, for example, that after they finished reading the book, I did a writer's night with them online. And I really enjoy doing that because it's interesting. First of all, every writer likes to talk about their books. They're like our children, and we're proud of them. But it was interesting doing it in that format because you got to see the person who was talking to you and got to hear their questions and interact with the book club like that. So yeah, book clubs, schools, classes, any group I would be glad to talk about or talk in front of.
Awesome. And I will put a link to your website in the show notes so people who are interested in finding you or your books or chatting with you about a visit can do so nice and easy. We're going to remind our listeners the book is called The Bookseller's Son by Bob Seay. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and chat with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this, and I'm glad that you liked the book.